Hello, my name is William, the Avid reader, and today I'm reviewing Understanding International Conflicts, an Introduction to Theory and History, written by Joseph S. Nice Jr. in 2000. So this is a book on global politics and international conflicts in general. It's a bit of a history book too, since it goes from the Peloponnesian War until like the year 2000. And it's written by this liberal international relations theorist called Joseph Nye. And how he presents things here are in a quite nuanced way. So he brings in realism and liberalism and critical theories like constructivism, and then makes a nuanced view where he applies different theories to different situations. So there are 8 chapters. And he begins with the Peloponnesian War, as I said, and he's just bringing up of how two cities did this war, that it involved realism, and that the principles of democratic versus oligarchic government in ancient Greece were ignored here. Joseph Nice, one of the things he often discusses is how the war could have been prevented, different wars could have been prevented. So it then goes on to discussing how the balance of power was one of the reasons that World War One was not prevented. So World War One he argues could have been prevented, and he talks about the precipitating causes of a thing that happens, and then things that happen more medium term ago, and then long term consequences. For example, one of the ways that many wars were prevented were by the skillful leadership by Bismarck. Because Bismarck, he was Chancellor from Germany from 1870 to 1890, and he did not bring in nationalism, because when he annexed territory like he did in Austria sometime, because he understood that nationalism can have deep-rooted consequences and can lead to unnecessary war, and also he did not have rigid alliances. So just before World War I, you had the bipolarity of alliances being, so you had the Central Powers on one side and then the Allies on another. And you could see the United States were forced to intervene in the war because of the trade, the investments forced them were large to the British and French side, more especially British side. So United States had to intervene in World War I because of that. And he also talks about then of the Treaty of Versailles, how it was unfair to Germany, and it also created the worst situation of both wars, where it left an open question on future German territory in the east. So westward, there was no question this is French or British or Belgium or whatever. But in the east, yes, you might join together eventually, possibly in Austria or Czechoslovakia or Poland and things like that. So that left an opening for Hitler to start taking advantage of the system. So the problem in the 1920s were the West were too harsh on Germany or Weimar Republic, but then in the 30s they were too light on Germany. And he argues that A.J.P. Taylor was wrong in thinking that Hitler was just an opportunist who seized territory. Joseph Nye argues that it's partially true, but also that Hitler was a fanatic who really wanted war, and that he was afraid that he was going to get another Munich agreement one with the Danzig seizing in Poland, since he really wanted war for some reason. And here you see how ideologies can doom you. And you saw the balance of power, the realist alliance between the democratic liberal West and the communist authoritarian East, who like to crush fascism. And then there's talk about how the Cold War developed. So the Cold War, he believes, would have developed anyway. However, it was not to as strong degrees. So George Kennan, who was ambassador to the Soviet Union from the United States for some time, he argued that the United States should hold a firm position, but it should not be based on ideology. So the mistake that Harry Truman made was that this is a battle between freedom and communism and things like that. So that's why the Soviet Union had to make more of an effort to control their things. because there's belief that maybe there could have been an early collapse of communism, or it could have been contained better if it was not about communism, because making Russia and communism the same thing was not actually true, because you had communist nations who went to war with each other. So you had Vietnam and Cambodia, or China and the Soviet Union, who stopped being allies eventually. So the myth that similar ideologies don't go to war was disproven. And we saw some Soviet imperialism too. And here we also see that the Cuban Missile Crisis was not a victory really for the United States, as the United States had missiles in Turkey, nuclear missiles in Turkey, and Russia put nuclear missiles in Cuba, and this was to protect Cuba from American invasion. So there was a deal that Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, and the United States removed their missiles from Turkey. And here you see that Kennedy's cabinet was not at all moderate. They were not afraid at all really from the Soviet nuclear missile attacks. So we saw the dynamics up there. And then there's talk about the Vietnam War was useless, it was not going to succeed. And then after the Cold War, it collapsed. Here we see how the individual plays in international politics, because the reason that the Soviet Union collapsed was in large part because of Gorbachev's more liberal reforms. So we restructured society in the late 80s first by perestroika, where he tried to restructure the Soviet government, but since Soviet bureaucrats refused, then he decided to liberalize through political rights, glasnost, openness. But that caused that there was a revolution from the bottom up, which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and in splitting into the separate republics. And now we have a lot of those countries which are democracies. Let's talk about that, but we've seen a lot of other things. And he discussed that it was unsure if Russia would remain democratic. Remember, because it's an unstable democracy, remember that this was written in 2000. So this was just when Putin came to power. So we didn't know a lot about him, but now we know that Russia has leaned more towards totalitarianism. Is it a dictatorship? It's a liberal democracy, at least, that's for sure. And there's also the discussion how the Arab states, there was a mix of realism in there. For example, that in the Iran-Iraq war, even though the Syria and Iraq had a similar ideology, Syria backed Iran to balance power, to not have Iraq become too powerful. There's also talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with the Arab states invading for both ideological and also a realist reason. And we saw also that the international community intervention, so the United States has intervened in the Suez Canal crisis in the 50s, and also we saw their intervention in the first Gulf War when Iraq invaded Kuwait. And we saw that the United States did some things, but it was highly ineffective during the Bosnian crisis in Yugoslavia with human rights abuses done by this Milosevic from Serbia. The problem with this, I believe, was that here's a very unnuanced part of this book. With the Yugoslav wars only bringing up the Serbian atrocities war. That is not true. Serbia was not the only bad guy in the Yugoslav wars. They were the main bad guys, but they were not the only one who committed war crimes. So that was, kind of dishonest. But remember, this guy Joseph Nye, he worked for Bill Clinton, so he's going to have some bias when he had structured his foreign policy towards different things. So yeah, and also that China will be okay from the liberal perspective since it's being integrated in the international system, and that there will not be really many wars. And wars now tend to be internal instead of across countries, so there are not multi-countries war. And intervention could be argued should be done when there are human rights abuses. So, for example, genocide in Rwanda, but that was highly ineffective because there was a bickering. And talks about oil and how it gradually shifted from the power of oil from the United States to OPEC countries, because the United States produced proportionally less and less oil, and they switched in the 70s, even if OPEC exists in 1960, was made in 1960. But anyway, OPEC is still quite ineffective since there are multinational corporations who prefer to have the interest of the West at heart for economic reason than the OPEC. So yeah, OPEC is not that powerful as some things, and interdependence is increasing. But this makes that, for example, the socialists could not make whatever economic laws they could wanted to do in France because that would have companies fleeing away. So that's a benefit of economic interdependence, that companies leave when people make bad economic policies. It's also there's also the information age. So he discusses that in a nuanced way. I'm not going to go into detail of that. And then the final chapter is about the New World Order. So one thing that is sure is that the state actor model is dead now. So states are the main actor in the global stage, but NGOs matter too, criminal syndicates matter too. Also, terrorist organizations are a big problem. Corporations also matter. And then there's discussion of what the state should do transnationally. So terrorism and drug enforcement, that's fine, he believes, but then they can overreach. That's was seen in, for example, Vietnam. So now we can also contrast the realism versus complex interdependence, which is basically liberal economics and different things. So in world trade, so at the fore end of realism, you've got the Middle East situation, and then on the complex interdependence region, you've got the United States-Canadian relations, and then in the middle at the time you had American-Chinese relations and American-Russian relations. And so basically what he talks about in this global politics book. So would I rate Understanding International Conflicts by Joseph Nye? I would rank it 8 out of 10. It's a very nuanced book. He covers a lot of things. He discusses both the realist perspective and then debunks some of the things that as he said there, that's not true. He brings in some constructivism to reinforce the liberalism of how things work. He mentions people like Kant several times and different authors to reinforce his points, and he does this very well, I would say. So yeah, 8 out of 10. There are some minor negative things, like there's some statism, so of course, in international liberals, because they're not classical liberals, international liberals. He's probably a neoliberal, but also he mentions that he took away the things of neoliberalism and neorealism to explain the origins of different ideologies, so we can understand them better and then apply them to where it's appropriate. So yeah, he did this very well. So 8 out of 10. So Joseph Nye, you're a good international relations philosopher. So Understanding International Conflicts is a good book. So this was the Avid Reader's review of Understanding International Conflicts, an introduction to theory and history, written by Joseph Nye in 2000. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I will see you guys next time.